Frida Kraus was 41 years old, and she was the most careful person Minna had ever met. She had been a seamstress in Stuttgart, which meant she was a person who understood that the difference between something that lasted and something that fell apart was almost always invisible to the naked eye. It was in the seam, in the tension of the thread, in the choice of material for a specific purpose. She applied this understanding to everything. She did not trust things that looked solid until she had examined their construction. She was carrying something inside her coat, wrapped carefully in a square of cloth, a spool of thread, dark blue, wound-tight, the kind of thread made to last. She had carried it from Stuttgart. She did not know why she had brought it and not something else, except that a spool of thread represented a specific kind of faith, that there would be something on the other side of this worth mending. In her coat pocket she also carried a photograph of her mother. She had not looked at it since boarding the ship. A man appeared at the head of the line. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been in the sun too long and had the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He wore the uniform of a major in the United States Army Medical Corps, and he carried a clipboard with the matter-of-fact authority of a man who uses one every day. He was perhaps 44 years old. His name was Major Douglas Hartley. He moved down the line of women with a quietness that did not match his size. He looked at each woman for a moment, made a note on his clipboard, and moved to the next. Not in a way that felt dehumanizing, in a way that felt strangely professional, as if he was looking at patients, not prisoners. He stopped briefly in front of Minna. His eyes moved over her with clinical efficiency. He wrote something. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply noted what he saw and moved on. Later, Minna would learn that what he had written next to her prisoner number, 107, was this: height 5 feet 4 inches. Estimated weight 82 pounds. BMI approximately 14.1. Priority intake, controlled refeeding protocol. Week 1, 1,400 calories per day. Monitor for refeeding syndrome. Daily weight checks. She did not know any of this yet. What she knew was that this man had looked at her and written something down, and that the act of being looked at carefully, of being noted, felt like something she had not experienced in a very long time. She was not sure she had a word for it. The closest she could come was seen. Behind Major Hartley walked Corporal James Pullman, from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. 22 years old, slightly awkward in his uniform, as if he was still growing into it. He had been assigned to Camp Hearn 3 months ago and had spent most of that time wondering what exactly his role was supposed to be in this flat, hot place, far from the fighting that had ended without him. His mother had told him, "Be useful." So he tried to be useful. He carried the major's second clipboard and handed it over when needed and tried to be invisible in the precise way that useful people are sometimes invisible. There was one more man. He appeared during processing, when the women were led in small groups to a wooden building marked intake and asked to state their names and occupations. He stood to the side of the table and translated. His German was perfect. Not textbook perfect, the clipped, formal German of someone who learned it in a classroom, but the real kind, with the rhythm and color of a language spoken at a kitchen table. The kind of German that only comes from growing up with it alongside something else. His name was Corporal George Albrecht. He was 31 years old. His grandfather, Wilhelm Albrecht, had left the village of Regensburg, Bavaria, in 1891, aboard a ship bound for New York with $43 and a complete inability to speak English. He had ended up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where George had grown up speaking German with his grandmother, who had lived to 91 and never entirely trusted the American Postal Service. When Minna stood before the table, she stated her name and occupation clearly, without lowering her eyes. Teacher. Latin and history. Secondary school. 11 years. George translated without inflection. Then Minna said, before she could stop herself, "Your German is from Bavaria." George looked at her. A small pause. "My grandfather was from Regensburg." "You speak it at home?" "With my grandmother. She died 2 years ago." Minna looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I taught Latin for 11 years. I know what it means to carry a dead language with you." George said nothing, but something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition. Then he turned to the next woman in line, and the moment was over. That afternoon they were shown to Barracks C6. 10 women to a room. Narrow beds with thin mattresses and folded wool blankets. Gray-green, standard issue. A wooden footlocker at the end of each bed. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling. On one wall, a small printed sign that read, "Keep cleanliness. It means health." Below it, a metal rack holding towels. Clean white towels folded in thirds. Latte stood in the doorway and did not go in for a long moment. Minna went in first and sat on the edge of the nearest bed. She pressed her hand flat against the mattress. Thin, yes, but it smelled of nothing, of clean air and pressed cotton. She could not remember the last time something smelled of nothing. Frida went immediately to her footlocker and opened it, examined its construction, and closed it. Hilda sat on her bed and looked at her hands. Berta Werner stood in the center of the room and looked at everything. The walls, the ceiling, the lamp, the rack of towels, the sign. She was measuring the gap between what she saw and what she had expected to see, and trying to determine what that gap meant. The bathhouse. They were taken there in a group in the late afternoon. A low building near the northern edge of the women's compound. The air was cooler on the shaded side. Steam rose faintly from vents along the roof. Corporal Pullman held the door open and looked at a point somewhere above their heads. His face was red. "Hot water," he said. "Towels on the bench. Soap on the shelf. 10 minutes each." He paused. "There's plenty of hot water." Then he stepped back and looked at the fence. They went in. The room was white-tiled and steaming. Rows of metal fixtures along the walls, each with a valve and a showerhead. On a long wooden bench, stacks of folded towels, white, thick enough to be called thick. And on the shelf above them, in rows, small brown paper-wrapped bars, each printed with the same words. U.S. Army soap, standard issue. No one moved. Minna had spent 4 days in a boxcar. Weeks before that in conditions designed, whether by intention or indifference, to remove every ordinary comfort from a human life. She had not had access to hot water in months. And now she was standing in a room full of it, with the valves right there, and the steam already rising from the pipes, and the towels folded on the bench and the soap on the shelf. She did not move. It was Minna who reached out first. Her hand moved to the valve. She gripped the metal, cool to the touch, smoother than she expected, well maintained. She turned it. There was a sound inside the pipe, a rush, a clearing, and then the water came. Hot, immediately hot, arriving as heat from the first moment, and the steam rose around her hands and she pulled them back reflexively, then reached in again. The heat went through her skin and into her bones. She had not realized, until that moment, how cold she had been. Not the cold of temperature alone, but the deeper cold that accumulates over months of deprivation. The cold that settles into muscle and does not leave, that becomes part of how you move, how you hold yourself, how you sleep. She had been cold for so long she had forgotten she was cold. Behind her she heard Latte make a sound, very small, like a gasp that had been cut short by surprise. Then she heard the other valves turning, one by one, and the room filled with the sound of falling water and rising steam. The white tiles disappeared into fog. The shapes of the other women became soft, blurred at the edges. Minna reached for a bar of soap. She unwrapped it. Inside was a pale bar, smooth, with faint ridges from its mold. She lifted it to her nose. Vanilla, very faint, and beneath that something floral, something near lavender. She stood with the bar under the water and felt it become slick in her hands. The soap lathered. She had forgotten what that looked like. The white foam spreading across her palms, so ordinary, so completely ordinary, that she stood still for several seconds simply watching it. Minna said, "And was it done correctly?"
Georg translated.
Hartley looked up from his ledger and said something that took George a moment longer to render. "He says," George said carefully, "that correctly is not a word he uses for something this important. He uses sufficient. He asks himself every day whether what he did today was sufficient. He says he will ask himself that for the rest of his life." Hartley put his pen back in his shirt pocket and moved on to the next bed. Minna watched him go. On a Saturday evening in the 4th week, Berta Werner found the radio. She had been looking for something like it since the first day, with the methodical patience of a woman trained to locate resources in environments that did not volunteer them. She found it in the maintenance shed near the laundry building, partially disassembled, tucked behind a shelf of cleaning supplies. A small receiver, civilian grade, left behind by some previous occupant of the shed. She took it back to the barracks in pieces inside Frida's canvas bag, and reassembled it under her bed during the afternoon rest period. That night, very late, she gathered 4 women in the corner furthest from the door. Lotte, Frida, 2 others from the adjacent bunks. She did not invite Minna. She did not invite Hilda. But Minna was awake. She was almost always awake at that hour. She lay with her face turned toward the wall and listened. The radio came on very low, a faint hiss and crackle, and then a voice. German. Clear, measured, authoritative. The accent was standard Hochdeutsch, the kind used by broadcasters and officials and people who wanted to sound like they came from everywhere and nowhere at once.
Minna listenet.
The voice described American prisoner of war camps as sites of systematic psychological coercion. It described the practice of offering comfort to female prisoners as a deliberate technique designed to erode German identity and cultural loyalty. It described women who accepted American food and American soap as having betrayed something essential about themselves. Lotte made a small sound. Berta said, very quietly, "This is what they are actually doing. The kindness is the method." Then Hilda Steiner, from her bed across the room, spoke. She had not moved. She was still lying on her side, facing the window. She said, "What station is that?" Berta hesitated. "A German broadcast." "I know what it sounds like," Hilda said. "I'm asking what station." Silence. Hilda turned over. In the faint light from the window, she looked at Berta with the flat, patient expression of someone who has been in field conditions and is accustomed to sorting accurate information from inaccurate information because her life depended on it. "If it were a German station," Hilda said, "it would not be broadcasting. Germany surrendered 4 months ago. There are no German stations. So I am asking again, what station is that?" No one answered. Hilda looked at the radio. Then she lay back down and said, to the ceiling, "If they are lying about the station, find out what else they are lying about before you decide what to believe." She closed her eyes. Berta looked at the radio, then at the women around her. Then she reached over and turned it off. The next morning, Minna found George Albrecht near the intake building, reviewing papers in the early sun. She approached him directly. "Last night we heard a radio broadcast," she said. "In German. Hochdeutsch." The content was negative about this camp, describing what is happening here as psychological warfare. What station was it? George put down his papers. "There is a broadcast operation called ABSIE," he said. "American Broadcasting Station in Europe. It transmits in German. It was run during the war to counter Axis propaganda, and after the surrender it continued in various forms." He paused. "Some of the people who ran it were German. People who had left Germany before the war or during it. They had their own ideas about what German people needed to hear." Minna looked at him. "So it was not a German station?"
No.
"And the content?" "The content," George said, "was written by people who believed they were helping, or by people who had other reasons for saying what they said." He picked up his papers. "There are many ways to use a language. Speaking someone's language does not mean you are speaking for them." Minna stood in the morning sun and thought about this. She thought about every document she had read in Bremen, every newspaper, every announcement posted on the school board, every word she had read and accepted because it was printed in her language, in the familiar shapes of German letters, and had the sound of authority. She thought about what it meant that she had never asked, until now, who had written any of it. The film was shown on a Thursday evening.
No announcement. No properastion.
The women of the camp were told simply that there would be a viewing in the recreation hall after supper, and that attendance was expected. Major Hartley had used that word specifically, and George had translated it exactly, and neither of them had offered any further explanation. The recreation hall was a converted mess space with rows of wooden chairs facing a canvas screen. A real projector sat on a table near the back. The hall smelled of pine boards and the residue of many meals. The women filed in and took seats. Minna sat near the middle. Lotte sat beside her, close enough that their arms touched. Hilda sat one row ahead and to the left, alone. Frida sat in the back row. Berta Werner sat near the door. The lights went down. The projector clattered to life. There was no title card. No narration at the beginning. The film simply began. It took Minna perhaps 15 seconds to understand what she was looking at. The footage was black and white, slightly overexposed in places, captured in haste by someone who understood that speed mattered more than composition. It showed a gate, then a road, then a field, and in the field, stacked and arranged in a way that the human mind initially refuses to categorize, were human bodies. Not bodies in the sense of soldiers fallen in combat, which has its own terrible grammar. These were bodies in a different sense entirely. The bodies of people who had been alive not long ago, who had eaten and spoken and thought, who had names that were now unreachable. They were stacked with the careless efficiency of a material problem solved by someone who had stopped seeing them as anything other than a material problem. The camera moved. It showed the living. Men and women and children who were not yet dead but were only recently on the right side of that line, standing in the light of liberation with the particular expression of people who have stopped believing that liberation was possible and now cannot fully process that it has arrived. Their arms and legs were the arms and legs of people from whom everything had been taken. Their eyes were the eyes of people who had been required to witness things that human beings are not built to witness. American soldiers moved through the footage. Young men, many of them in the same kind of pressed khaki shirts that Corporal Pullman wore. They were not heroic in the footage. They were not triumphant. They were often simply standing still with expressions that had not yet resolved into anything nameable. Some of them were crying in the unself-conscious way of people who are not thinking about being seen. One soldier, barely 20, sat down in the mud with his face in his hands. The camera did not look away from him. Berta Werner left after 6 minutes. Minna heard the chair scrape, heard the door open and close, did not turn around. Minna's hands were in her lap. She did not move them. She did not look away. Hilda, one row ahead, sat completely still for the entire 38 minutes. Minna could see the line of her shoulders, the particular set of them, and she recognized what that stillness meant. It was not the stillness of someone who was shutting something out. It was the stillness of someone who was letting something in, fully, without flinching, because they had already learned that the truth does not become easier to carry by looking away from it. At some point during the film, without any sound, Hilda began to cry. Not for herself. Minna was certain of this. Not for the brothers she had lost at Stalingrad. She was crying in the way of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand, and the understanding costs them more than they expected, and they are paying it anyway because there is no other honest option. When the lights came up, the room was silent. George, who had been standing near the side wall, said quietly, to anyone who was listening, "Major Hartley wanted you to see this, not to punish you, not to make you feel a specific thing. He believes that people who have been told a version of the world deserve to see the version that was happening at the same time." Minna looked at her hands. "We knew there were camps," she said. A pause. "We knew they existed." Georg waited. "But knowing," she said, and she stopped because the sentence did not have an ending she was prepared to say out loud. According to Record Group 389, Camp Hearn Medical Log, held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, Major Douglas Hartley's entry for August 14, 1945 reads as follows: 8-week assessment complete. The garden had been Frida's idea in the 5th week. She had approached Corporal Pullman with a question, translated through George, about whether the strip of earth behind Barracks C6 might be made available for cultivation. Pullman had said he would ask. Major Hartley said yes without hesitation and requisitioned seeds from the supply office. Carrot, onion, rosemary. The women had worked the earth in the early mornings before the heat became serious. Frida directed. Lotte dug with more enthusiasm than precision. Hilda worked in silence and produced perfectly even rows. Minna mostly crouched at the edge and watched, occasionally pressing a seed into the earth when Frida indicated, because she was not a person who had ever grown anything, and she was aware that she was learning something she should perhaps have known earlier. By September, the rosemary was substantial. The carrots were ready to pull. On the Thursday after the announcement, Minna went to the garden in the late afternoon and sat on the ground beside the rosemary. The earth was warm from the day's sun, still holding it, the way earth does, more faithfully than stone. She pulled a sprig of rosemary and held it between her fingers, crushed it slightly. The smell was immediate and strong and very specific, the kind of smell that arrives in the back of the mind before the front of it has time to react. And what it arrived with, in Minna's case, was the memory of her mother's kitchen in Bremen. A small kitchen on the second floor of a house that no longer existed. A window that looked onto a courtyard. The smell of rosemary on a Sunday, which was the day her mother cooked the things that took time. She sat in the Texas earth and held the sprig and let herself remember. This was something she had been learning to do. Not to push the memory back into its category and label it and store it. To let it arrive. To let it cost what it cost. To pay and remain present anyway. Lotte found her there. The girl sat down without asking, which she would not have done in the first weeks. She sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the rosemary. "I've been thinking about what Major Hartley said," Lotte said. "About taking something useful with us." "What have you concluded?" Lotte considered. "I think I'm taking the fact that I was afraid and it turned out to be wrong." She pulled a leaf from the rosemary sprig Minna was holding and looked at it. "I was afraid of everything here. The soap, the food, the guards, the fact that they smiled. And none of it was what I was afraid of." Minna said, "What were you afraid of underneath all of that?" Lotte thought about this seriously, the way she had learned to think about serious things. "That I had believed something that wasn't true," she said. "And that knowing that would mean I was—" She stopped. "Responsible," Minna said. Lotte looked at her. "Yes," she said quietly. "That." Minna turned the rosemary sprig in her fingers. "I think," she said, "that is precisely what we are taking with us. The thing we were most afraid to know." She paused. "And I think that is not a small thing. I think it is, actually, the only thing that matters." They sat in the garden until the light began to change. The sun moving toward the treeline, the shadows of the rosemary lengthening across the warm earth. The night before the departure list was posted, Berta Werner went over the fence. Minna heard her leave. She was not asleep. She heard Berta rise from her bed at a time she estimated was somewhere past 2 in the morning. She heard the careful, practiced sound of someone moving without wanting to be heard. The soft placement of each footstep. The controlled release of the door latch. She did not call out. Berta was gone for 35 minutes. Corporal Pullman found her on the eastern perimeter, standing in the dry grass outside the fence with her arms at her sides and no particular plan in evidence. He had been on the overnight patrol, walking it in the slow, considered way of a young man who has learned that the night is not dangerous but deserves to be taken seriously. He stopped when his flashlight found her. She stood in the beam of it and did not move. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and turned the flashlight away from her face, pointing it down at the ground between them, so that the light was present but not accusatory. Then he said, "Ma'am, it's cold out here. Come back inside." He reached into his jacket and removed his field coat, the heavy one he wore against the night air that dropped sharply after midnight in September, and he held it out. Berta Werner looked at the coat. She had been a junior auxiliary officer in the Wehrmacht Administrative Corps. She had processed orders and filed reports and maintained records for men who were conducting a war that she had believed, as completely as Minna had believed other things, was necessary and correct and destined to succeed. She had maintained that belief through a ship crossing and a train ride and 12 weeks in a camp that had done everything wrong according to the framework she had built her understanding of the world on. She had gone over the fence tonight not because she intended to escape. She was a precise enough thinker to know that escape was not viable. She had gone over the fence because she could not stand, one more night, the feeling of something changing inside her that she had not given permission to change. She looked at the coat. She looked at Corporal Pullman, who was 22 years old and from a small town in Ohio and who had not flinched or reached for his weapon or raised his voice, who had simply turned the light away from her face and offered her his coat. She took it. She put it on. It was too large for her, the shoulders hanging past her own, the hem reaching her thighs. It smelled of wool and Texas night air and the particular soap that all the American soldiers used, which she had spent 12 weeks telling herself was a weapon. She walked back through the gap in the fence. Pullman walked beside her, not behind her, which was a difference she noticed and did not have a category for. The following morning, Major Hartley reviewed the incident. He read Pullman's report, which was brief and factual. Subject found outside the perimeter, returned voluntarily, no resistance, no injury. He noted the infractions applicable under Geneva Convention Article 54 and applied the minimum consequence allowable. Restricted movement for 7 days, noted in the file. He did not interview Berta. He did not require an explanation. What he did do was send, through George, a single message. The coat is yours to keep until you leave. Return it to Corporal Pullman on the day of transport. Berta received this message while sitting on her bed with Pullman's coat still around her shoulders. She read George's translation once, and then again, and then she folded the paper carefully and placed it in her footlocker. She did not leave the barracks for several hours. Minna sat beside her, the way she had sat beside Lotte when Lotte could not sleep, and the way Ruth Calloway had sat beside both of them on different difficult evenings. Not speaking, not requiring anything, simply being a person in the same room, which turned out to be, most of the time, exactly enough. At some point, Berta said, quietly, not looking at Minna, "I don't know how to stop." "Stop what?" "Expecting the other thing," Berta said. "The thing that was supposed to come. The punishment. The proof." She paused. "I keep waiting for it, and it doesn't come. And not coming is worse, somehow, because if it doesn't come," Minna said, "then you have to consider the possibility that it was never going to come." Berta was silent. "And if it was never going to come," Minna continued, "then the reason you believed it would come has to be examined." "I'm not ready to examine it," Berta said. "You don't have to be ready," Minna said. "You just have to be here." Berta turned and looked at her. For the first time, Minna saw in Berta Werner's face something that had not been there before. Not surrender, not weakness, something more difficult and more honest than either of those things. The expression of someone who has been wrong for a very long time and is beginning, slowly, at great cost, to know it. It was Lotte who found the book. On a Wednesday afternoon, 1 week before the first transport, the women of Barracks C6 had been assigned to help sort and reorganize the camp library, a small wooden building near the chapel that held donated books, outdated magazines, and a collection of German-language titles assembled with evident care by someone who understood that language was not a luxury. Lotte was pulling books from the lower shelf to dust them when she found it. A thin volume, blue cloth cover, faded to gray-blue at the spine. Goethe, the poems. She pulled it out and opened the front cover. Inside the front cover, in pencil, small and careful, donated by West Liberty High School, Iowa, 1944. For the women who will remember what beauty feels like. And below that, in a different hand, the same pencil but looser, younger, Greta Hausmann, class of 1943. Lotte stood with the book in her hands for a moment. Then she read the name aloud. She was not sure why she read it aloud. Perhaps because names, she had learned, deserved to be spoken. Perhaps because this one in particular felt like it required a voice, required the air to carry it for a moment, required to exist as sound and not just marks on paper. Greta Hausmann. George, who had been helping carry boxes near the door, looked up. Minna, who had been organizing the German titles on the far shelf, turned around. Lotte said, "Greta Hausmann, from Iowa, class of 1943. She looked at George. "That's a German name." George set down his box and came to look. He read the inscription. He was quiet for a moment. "There were communities," he said carefully. "German families who had been in America for generations. Midwest mostly. Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. People who spoke German at home. Who had German names, German churches, German newspapers. After the war started, some of them changed their names. Some of them didn't. Some of them, he looked at the book, sent things like this. Minna took the book from Latte and held it. She thought about a girl in Iowa in 1944. A girl with a German name and an American life, who had taken this book from wherever she kept her books and written her name in it and given it away. For the women who will remember what beauty feels like. She had not written for the enemy. She had not written for prisoners. She had written for women. Just women. People who might, under different circumstances, have been people she knew. Minna turned to the first poem. She read it silently. Her Latin teacher's mind moved through the German lines the way it moved through any text, finding the architecture of the meaning underneath the surface of the words. And what she found in Goethe's poem, in this specific book, in this specific library, in this camp in Texas, was something she had been teaching students about for 11 years without quite understanding it herself. That beauty is not an escape from truth. It is a way of carrying truth without being crushed by it. She closed the book. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she said, to the room, to no one in particular, "We should keep this one out." For the last week. Nobody disagreed. The day before the first transport, Ruth Calloway came to Barracks C6 in the early evening. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth. She moved through the room with quiet efficiency, but there was something different in her manner, some small thing that Minna identified as the careful quality of someone trying not to show that they are feeling something particular. She stopped at Minna's bed. She held out the wrapped cloth. Minna took it. It was light. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a handkerchief, white cotton, with delicate embroidered edges. In the corner, stitched in pale blue thread, 2 initials, RC. And inside the handkerchief, wrapped in a layer of tissue paper, a bar of soap. Pale, smooth, the same kind they had been given since the first day. On the tissue paper, in Ruth's handwriting, for someone's mother, sister, or daughter. Minna held it and could not immediately speak. Ruth said in her careful German, "My mother taught me that the point of giving something is not that the other person deserves it. The point is that you have it and they need it and you can bridge that distance." She paused. She was very practical about things like this. Minna said, "Your mother, did she ever come back to Munich?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Once," she said. "In 1952. She stood in front of the house in Schwabing and looked at it for a long time. Someone else lived there. She didn't knock." Ruth looked at her hands. She said she didn't go to ask for it back. She went to know that it was still standing, that the house existed, that her childhood existed in a form she could point to. A pause. She said that was enough, just to know it was there. Minna thought about Bremen, about the school on Contrescarpe, about whether it was still standing, about whether, when she got home, she would want to go and look. She said, "Do you think she forgave them? The people who—" "I don't know," Ruth said. She didn't use that word. She used a different word. She paused. She said she decided not to carry it. Not because it wasn't heavy, because she had other things she needed her hands for. Minna looked at the handkerchief, at the initials in blue thread, at the soap wrapped in tissue paper. She said, "Your mother sounds like someone I would have been afraid to meet." Ruth said, "She would have liked you." Minna looked up. "She respected people who were willing to reconsider," Ruth said. She said it was the rarest thing. The morning of October 3rd arrived with a thin gray overcast and a stillness in the air that felt like the camp itself was pausing, holding a breath it had been holding since June. The trucks were in the yard by 7. 4 of them, olive green, canvas-covered, the engines idling in the quiet morning. Pullman was helping load bags. Other soldiers moved around the perimeter with the organized purposefulness of people executing a plan made in advance. Minna stood in front of Barracks C6 for the last time. She looked at the building, at the white trim that she had noticed on the first day because it seemed absurd, painting a barracks building, as if it were a house in a neighborhood. At the small garden at the corner, the rosemary still green and substantial, the last of the carrots pulled the previous afternoon and distributed through the barracks in small portions that the women ate without ceremony and without wasting a single piece. She thought about 11 years of Latin instruction.
Veni, vidi, vici.
Him I saw, I conquered. She had always taught that phrase as an example of rhetorical compression, the way Caesar reduced an entire campaign to 3 words. She had never paid enough attention to what was missing from those 3 words. What the conquered might have felt. What the land looked like after. What remained when the triumph was over. She thought she might teach it differently now. George was nearby, checking his list. Minna walked to him. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. "For the German," she said. "For using it the way you used it. As if it belonged to both of us." George was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother used to say that a language is a house. Many people live in the same house. Some of them do terrible things in it. That doesn't mean you burn down the house." He paused. "She said you stay and you repair it and you make sure that what happens in it next is something you can stand behind." Minna said, "Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked to know." "She would have argued with you constantly," George said. "She had opinions about everything." "I'm a Latin teacher," Minna said. "I'm used to that." He smiled briefly and then went back to his list. Corporal Pullman was lifting bags when Berta Werner approached him. She was wearing his field coat over her travel dress, belted at the waist with a strip of canvas. She had worn it every day for the past week, in the unselfconscious way of someone who has decided that a thing is useful and therefore will be used. She held it closed at the collar with one hand against the morning chill. She stopped in front of him. He lowered the bag he was holding and looked at her. She reached up and removed the coat. She held it out. He took it. Then she looked at him directly, the steady look that Minna had seen her use when she meant to be understood without intermediary. She said in German, knowing he would not understand the words, "Du hast mir ein Deck gegeben, als ich nix wert war." You gave me a blanket when I was worth nothing. She paused.
Ich vergesse das nicht.
I will not forget that. He did not understand the words. But he understood the tone, which was the tone of someone saying something they had decided to say after a long time of deciding. He nodded once, the small, serious nod of a young man who knows when gravity is required. She turned and walked to the truck. Hilda, who had not said much in the days since the film, embraced Ruth briefly before climbing in, a gesture that surprised everyone present, including, it seemed, Hilda herself. Frida handed Ruth a small object as she passed. A length of the dark blue thread from Stuttgart, wound neatly around a sliver of card. Ruth took it and looked at it and put it in her breast pocket. Lotte, climbing up, paused with one foot on the truck step and looked back at the camp. At the bathhouse roof with its faint morning vapor. At the chapel beyond the trees. At the garden. At the small printed sign visible through the open door of Barracks C6. Keep cleanliness. It means health. She looked at all of it for a long moment with the expression of someone taking a photograph without a camera. Then she climbed in. Minna was last. She stood at the truck's tailgate and turned to look at the camp one final time. The guard towers painted that slightly absurd fresh tan. The gravel paths swept clean. The American flag at the pole, moving in the light morning wind with the slow, unhurried authority of something that knew it would still be there long after this particular morning was done. She looked at Major Hartley, standing near the medical building with his clipboard. He raised one hand briefly, not quite a wave, a gesture of acknowledgement. She returned it. She looked at George, who was watching from near the gate. He nodded. She looked at Ruth, who was standing with her arms at her sides and her face arranged in the careful, organized way of a woman who has decided she will not cry until the trucks are gone. Ruth met her eyes and held them for a moment. Minna thought about hot water, about the first morning in the bathhouse, when she had stood under the stream and wept without knowing what she was weeping for, about 12 weeks of Tuesday mornings with Hartley's clipboard, about the film in the dark, about Frida's garden, about a blue cloth book with a penciled name inside the cover, about a handkerchief with 2 initials stitched in pale blue thread. She climbed into the truck. The camp grew small in the rear opening of the canvas as the trucks moved through the gate and onto the road. The bathhouse, the chapel steeple through the trees, the garden too small now to see, but there. Lotte sat beside Minna with her shoulder pressed against hers and the Goethe book in her lap, borrowed from the library with the specific permission of Corporal Pullman, who had said that anyone who wanted to take a book home from a library should be allowed to do so. Hilda sat across from them with her hands folded on her knees and her eyes forward. Frida had her canvas bag in her lap, the spool of thread inside it, the photograph of her mother. Berta Werner sat near the back opening, watching the camp diminish in the distance with an expression that Minna could not fully read. But she was watching. She was not looking away. Lotte reached into her coat pocket and removed a small sprig of rosemary, dried now, that she had broken from the garden the previous afternoon. She held it to her nose. She said, "It still smells like Sunday." Nobody spoke. But Minna reached out and took the sprig from Lotte and held it herself for a moment, and then passed it to Hilda, who took it without comment, and then to Frida, and then to Berta, who held it last, and who sat with it in her hand for the rest of the drive, not bringing it to her nose, simply holding it the way you hold something you are not yet sure what to do with but are not ready to put down. Minna Hartmann returned to Bremen in November 1945. The school on Contrescarpe was partially standing. The river was still there. The sky was still gray in the way of northern German skies, which had never changed and apparently had no interest in changing now. She taught until 1978. She taught Latin and history and, eventually, a course she designed herself that she described to the school board as a study in the relationship between language, belief, and responsibility. The school board approved it because she had tenure and because the description was abstract enough that no one was sure exactly what it meant. On the first day of each school year, she placed a bar of soap on her desk. Plain soap, nothing that called attention to itself. And when a student asked, as a student always did, she told them about a camp in Texas and a man with a clipboard and what hot water felt like after you had been without it for a very long time. She told them about what it means to agree to something so completely that the agreement becomes invisible. And she told them what it costs to see the agreement for what it is, and what it opens when you finally do. She kept a wooden box beside her sewing table until her death in 1991. Inside the box, a handkerchief with blue thread initials, a bar of soap, still wrapped in its original tissue paper, a letter which arrived in 1992, forwarded by the Red Cross through channels that had taken decades to open. She did not live to read it. Her daughter read it instead. It was from Ruth Calloway's daughter, in Wichita, Kansas. Ruth had died in 1974. Her daughter had found, among her mother's papers, the diary entry from October 3, 1945. The last line read, "They left with different eyes than the ones they arrived with." I don't know how to describe it except to say, they looked like people who had decided to be present for whatever came next. That is, I think, all any of us can do. Ruth's daughter had also found, in her mother's jewelry box, a length of dark blue thread wound around a sliver of card. She wrote, "My mother kept this until the end. She said she never used it because she was saving it for something worth mending. I think she meant something by that. I'm still working out what." Lotte Beeker taught primary school in Hamburg until 1984. She kept the Goethe book on the shelf above her desk. In November 1989, when the wall came down, she sat in her living room and watched the television footage with her granddaughter on her lap. When the footage showed crowds moving through the gate at Bornholmer Strasse, she reached over to the shelf and took the book down and opened the front cover. She read the name aloud. Greta Hausmann, class of 1943. Her granddaughter asked who that was. Lotte said, "Someone who believed that beauty belonged to everyone. Even in 1944. Even then." Her granddaughter looked at the name for a moment. Then she said, "Did she know that anyone would read it?" Lotte thought about this. "I think," she said, "that she wrote it because it was true, not because she knew someone would read it. Because it was true and she wanted it to exist somewhere outside her own head." Hilda Steiner returned to Leipzig and worked in a civilian hospital for the rest of her career. She did not speak of Camp Herne, not publicly, not to colleagues. But those who worked with her noticed certain things. The particular care she brought to folding linens. The way she addressed patients by name, always by name, before anything else. A young nurse who worked with her in the 1960s wrote, In a memoir published much later, Hilda Steiner taught me that the first act of medicine is not diagnosis. It is recognition. She said, look at the person first. The illness comes after. I never understood fully where this came from until I read about the women's camps in Texas and realized she had been on the other side of that kind of looking, once, and had never forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Berta Werner did not speak of Camp Hearn for 17 years. In the spring of 1962, she filed an application to the German Red Cross. The form asked for her qualifications. She listed them precisely: administrative experience, organizational training, fluency in written protocols. It asked for her reason for applying. She wrote one sentence: I was given a blanket when I had not earned it. I want to spend the rest of my life earning it. The interviewer, a retired physician named Dr. Walther Engel, read the sentence twice. He did not ask her to explain it. He approved the application the same afternoon. She worked in the organization until 1979. She was known for her precision and for an absolute inflexibility about standards of treatment that some colleagues found difficult and others found essential. A junior colleague wrote of her years later, Frau Werner had a rule she never broke. She said, you address the person before you address the problem. Always, without exception. I never asked where this came from. I understood it was not abstract. She kept Pullman's field coat until it fell apart in the mid-1970s. She did not replace it with anything similar. She simply noted, in her careful way, that it had lasted longer than she expected, which was, in her experience, what things did when they were given without condition. Major Douglas Hartley's medical records from Camp Hearn, Record Group 389, held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, were cited in a 1998 University of Texas study on nutritional rehabilitation in post-conflict populations. The study's authors described the records as the most methodically detailed documentation currently available on the practical management of refeeding protocol in civilian prisoner populations, and a remarkable example of institutional care applied with both clinical rigor and evident human regard. Hartley had retired to Des Moines, Iowa, in 1961. He died in 1981 at the age of 80, still writing in his ledger every morning, his own health, his own weight, his own condition, with the same careful precision he had applied to 40 women in a Texas camp in the summer and fall of 1945. The last entry in the ledger, written 3 days before his death, reads, condition unchanged, appetite fair, pain manageable, sufficient. He underlined it. No one knows why. The bathhouse at Camp Hearn was demolished in 1953 when the camp was decommissioned. Nothing marks the place now. There is no sign. No plaque. No indication that in the summer and fall of 1945, 40 women stood under hot water in that building and experienced something that took the rest of their lives to fully understand. But understanding does not require a plaque. It requires a person who carries it and passes it to another person who carries it further. And so it travels. Not in archives, though the archives matter. Not in studies, though the studies are important. In the smaller things. A bar of soap on a teacher's desk. A book with a name written in pencil. A length of blue thread wound around a sliver of card. A sprig of rosemary that smells 30 years later, precisely like a Sunday afternoon in Texas when the war was over and the water was hot and something that had been closed for a long time opened, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone declaring that it had happened. It just happened. The way most true things happen. Slowly, and then all at once, and then forever. The question Minna Hartmann whispered on the first night in Barracks C6, looking at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the Texas heat, was this: how could they afford this? She meant the soap, the water, the towels, the food. But by the time the trucks carried her back through the camp gate on October 3, 1945, she understood that the question had a different answer than she had expected. They could afford it because they had decided to, not because they had excess, not because the war had made them rich or comfortable or easy, but because someone at some level had decided that the cost of treating a person as a person was worth paying. That decency was not a luxury to be extended only when conditions were ideal. That it was, in fact, most necessary precisely when conditions were not ideal. When the person in front of you had been your enemy. When the person in front of you had believed things you found intolerable. When the easiest thing, the cheapest thing, the thing that required no explanation and no justification, would have been to give them nothing at all. They had chosen differently, and that choice, made by ordinary people in an ordinary camp in the flat Texas heat, in ledgers and soap bars and folded towels and a single sentence spoken in the dark, had traveled further than any of them knew. It is still traveling. That is what remains.